The mountains had always been a place of dreams for Lydia Hart, even before her life collapsed beneath her like a rotted floorboard. Her husband Thomas used to talk about the high country as if it were a sanctuary carved by God's own hands, clean rivers, tall pines, and land that could cradle a family for generations. One day, he would say, eyes bright, we'll build our own place up there. A cabin no one can take from us. He never got the chance. Winter fever took him fast 2 days from the first cough to his final breath. The doctor shook his head. The neighbors whispered in sympathy. And Lydia, swollen with their first child, stood beside the coffin feeling as though the world had ripped open beneath her feet. People meant well, but every soft word and pitying stare carved her deeper into grief. They brought casseroles and advice she didn't ask for. They told her to stay in town, near help, near midwives, near the church. They reminded her she was 8 months pregnant, too far along to take risks, too vulnerable to strike out on her own. But Lydia had always been more stubborn than people realized. She wasn't reckless, but she knew when a place was no longer hers. The little rental house on Maple Street carried echoes of Thomas she couldn't bear. Their life there had been temporary, just a stop on the way to something better. Staying meant accepting that her future would be shaped by other people's charity and expectations, not her own decisions. She refused that. So one quiet morning before dawn, Lydia packed the wagon. Every movement was a negotiation with her swollen belly lifting, bending, strapping down bundles, but she managed. Tools, blankets, flour, dried beans, her husband's old rifle, and the map he had drawn of the route to the homestead site. Thomas's handwriting, bold and hopeful, felt like a final nudge forward. She left town without fanfare. Only Mrs. Dorsey, her widowed neighbor, stood on her porch watching with a tight-lipped worry that made Lydia almost falter. But when Lydia lifted a hand in goodbye, Mrs. Dorsey simply nodded as if to say, "Go on, child. Be brave if you must." The trail started as a narrow road, then thinned into a rutted path rising toward the timberline. The mountains loomed ahead blue and solemn, their shoulders dusted with early snow. The air grew cooler with each mile, sharp enough to sting Lydia's nostrils. She kept her pace steady, mindful of the jolts the wagon sent through her body. Her baby kicked occasionally, a small reminder of why she had to keep going. Every hour, she paused to rest, to stretch her aching back, to sip water from the canteen. She was tired, bone-tired, but there was a fire inside her that exhaustion couldn't smother. Maybe it was Thomas's dream urging her on. Maybe it was the child inside her reminding her she had something left to fight for. Or maybe, deep down, Lydia simply refused to let tragedy be the last chapter of her life. By late afternoon, the pines thickened around her. Shadows lengthened between the trunks, and the sky took on the bruised tint that warned of a coming storm. Lydia pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She needed shelter soon. But before she could worry about that, she allowed herself a fragile moment of hope. She had made it this far alone. The mountains were close. The future uncertain, harsh, and unpromised waited for her to carve her way into it. And Lydia Hart, 8 months pregnant and determined beyond reason, intended to do exactly that. By the time Lydia reached the higher ridge, the air had changed. It was subtle at first, a faint metallic bite in the wind, a sharpness that prickled along her skin. She had grown up hearing old ranch hands talk about reading the sky like scripture, about the way storms whispered before they struck. As a girl, she doubted it. As a woman alone in the mountains, she trusted it with her life. Above her, the sky had begun its slow, ominous transformation. What had been pale blue that morning was now veiled in a heavy gray curtain, stretching from peak to peak like a gathering army. A low rumble rolled through the valley, distant, uncertain, yet unmistakably the voice of oncoming trouble. Lydia exhaled, long and steady. "Not now?" she murmured, resting a hand on her belly as if the child could answer. The baby shifted, a firm push that nudged against her ribs. She wasn't sure if it was encouragement or a warning. The wagon creaked beneath the strain of the slope, its old wooden wheels sinking into mud softened by the earlier frost melt. Lydia's mare, Juniper, snorted nervously and flicked her ears back. Even the animal sensed the coming shift. Another gust of wind tore through the trees, scattering golden pine needles and lifting Lydia's scarf enough to sting her cheek. She needed real shelter before the storm broke. She scanned the terrain, eyes moving from ridge to ridge. The mountains were a maze of slopes, fallen timber, and thick forest. The homestead site she sought was still at least a day's journey away, perhaps more if the weather turned against her. She had hoped to reach a plateau by evening, but the sky had stripped that hope away. A hard chill slithered down the back of her neck. She guided the wagon off the main path, steering through a narrow opening in the underbrush where the trees weren't quite so dense. The wheels bumped over exposed roots, jostling her enough to make her wince. Every unexpected jolt felt sharper than the last. Her body was stretched thin, her muscles strained, her breath catching in her chest. But she pressed on. Giving up was never part of her nature. Minutes turned into a slow, grinding hour. The forest around her thickened, muffling the world into a hush broken only by snapping branches and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. Then, almost as if the land took pity on her, the trees opened into a small clearing tucked between two shallow rises. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A cluster of fallen logs lay scattered across the ground, victims of last winter's storms. A shallow overhang of rock jutted from the hillside, offering just enough natural coverage to break wind and snow. The ground was uneven but workable. Relief washed through her so powerfully it left her dizzy. "This will do," she whispered to herself, sliding carefully from the wagon seat. Her boots sank into the soft earth. She stretched her back slowly, feeling the familiar ache radiate through her hips. The baby rolled again, and Lydia pressed a hand to her belly. "We'll have a roof over us soon." Just a little longer. A sudden, sharp crack split the air thunder, closer now. The sky darkened another shade, swallowing what little daylight remained. Lydia wasted no time. She unhitched Juniper, tying the mare beneath the rock overhang. Then she gathered her tools, a hatchet, a length of rope, and her husband's old hunting knife. Every second mattered now. With the storm pressing down on her like a physical weight, she began dragging the nearest log toward the rock face, her breath sharp, her movements determined. The wind picked up again. Pine branches swayed violently. Lightning flickered in the distance, brief but bright. Lydia didn't look back at the trail she had left behind. All that mattered now was surviving the night. Lydia had built things before: coops, fences, even a small shed behind the house back in town, but she had never built anything while 8 months pregnant, freezing, exhausted, and racing against a storm that threatened to swallow the mountains whole. Still, she set her jaw and dragged the first log toward the rock overhang. The wood was heavier than she expected. Fallen long ago, soaked by previous rains, rough with splintered bark. As she grasped it, her palms protested. The raw skin chafed from days on the trail, but she didn't loosen her grip. Bracing her feet in the soft earth, she pulled, inch by inch, her breath coming in short bursts that fogged the cold air. Thunder cracked again, closer, too close. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself. It was a trick Thomas had taught her. Speak the command aloud, and your body would obey even when your mind faltered. Just keep moving. She dragged the log beneath the rock ledge, propping one end against the stone. It wasn't a cabin, not even a proper lean-to yet, but if she arranged enough logs at the right angle, she could create a crude but solid barrier against the worst of the storm. It would keep the wind out at least, maybe the snow. She wasn't asking for comfort, just survival. Sweat beaded on her forehead even as the temperature dropped. She moved back into the clearing, selecting another log. This one was smaller, lighter, though still unwieldy. She bent, felt her belly press sharply against her thighs, and paused to breathe. The baby shifted again, and Lydia murmured, "I know. I'm hurrying." Her back spasmed as she lifted. Pain shot down her spine, sharp as a knife. She gasped and had to steady herself on her knees. For a terrifying moment, she thought a contraction had begun, but the pain eased after a slow count to 5. Not labor. Just strain. She could handle strain. She must. Slowly she dragged the second log beside the first, then a third, and a fourth. Her arms shook with the effort, but she didn't stop. She set each log at an angle, building a slanted wall that leaned into the rock face. It wasn't pretty. Thomas would have laughed kindly at her uneven technique, but he would have helped her, too guided her hands, strengthened her resolve. She felt him with her now, not in spirit but in the memory of every skill he'd taught her, every moment they'd spoken of building a life that could weather hardship. Wind tore through the clearing again, this time fierce enough to lift her skirts and scatter pine needles into her shelter. Lydia hurried, tying the logs together at the top with rope, securing them against the rock. When she tugged the final knot tight, her hands trembled. Not from fear, she was too busy to fear, but from sheer exhaustion. The sky opened. Rain fell first, cold and hard, pelting the trees like thrown gravel. Lightning split the clouds, illuminating the mountains in stark white. Lydia shoved the remaining supplies, the blankets, the satchel of tools, the flour sack under the shelter. She guided Juniper closer, soothing the mare with a hand on her neck as the animal shivered. The lean-to wasn't finished. She still needed to seal the gaps. Rainwater seeped through the cracks between logs, dripping onto the ground. Lydia grabbed handfuls of moss and damp earth, packing them like clay into every space she could reach. It was messy, desperate work, but it helped. Her breath came in ragged draws. Her knees ached. Her belly felt heavy as stone. When she crawled beneath the shelter at last, her arms weak and her muscles trembling, she finally allowed herself a single moment of stillness. The storm raged outside, wind howling, rain slashing, thunder shaking the ground. But inside her crude creation, she had a barrier between herself and the wild. She had built shelter out of nothing. She had saved herself. And the night was only beginning. Night didn't fall so much as collapse. One moment the world was a storm-dark gray. The next it was swallowed by a shadow so heavy it felt like a weight pressing against Lydia's shelter. Rain hammered the logs. Wind screamed between the trees like something alive. Every so often, lightning cracked across the sky, lighting the forest in ghost-white flashes that were gone before Lydia could fully register them. She sat beneath her crude lean-to, wrapped in her damp blanket, her back against the cold rock as she listened to the storm claw at the world outside. Juniper, tied close under the overhang, trembled occasionally, and Lydia murmured soft reassurance to her. The mare's presence steadied her, an anchor in the chaos. Her body, however, was less forgiving. A deep, dull ache throbbed through her lower back and hips, and a few times she felt tightness ripple across her belly. Each time, a sharp bolt of fear shot through her. Not now, she prayed silently. Not tonight. The baby kicked, a slow roll beneath her ribs, as if reminding her it too was fighting this night. Lydia reached for the rifle. Thomas's rifle. The wood was worn smooth where his hands had gripped it thousands of times. She ran her thumb along the barrel, drawing strength from the memory. She checked the chamber 2 bullets. Just 2. She couldn't waste them unless she absolutely had to. She set the rifle across her lap and fed another stick into the fire she decoaxed from kindling and dry bark tucked beneath the wagon since morning. The flames were small but warm, their glow pushing back a sliver of the darkness. Enough to remind her she wasn't helpless. The storm roared. Then, abruptly, it went quiet. Too quiet. Lydia held her breath, listening. The wind had died, but the storm hadn't passed. That kind of silence was unnatural. It curled around her like a warning. Juniper's ears stood up. The Mara lifted her head, nostrils flaring. A sound drifted through the clearing low at first, almost a murmur. Then another joined it, clearer, sharper. A howl. Lydia's stomach dropped. Wolves. They were close. Closer than she liked. Maybe drawn by Juniper. Maybe drawn by the scent of smoke or by the scent of hunger and vulnerability that seemed to cling to the cold night. She tightened her grip on the rifle, shifting her weight carefully so as not to startle the Mar. Her palm was slick with sweat despite the cold. The fire popped. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Another howl. This one further to the right. A third behind her. She was surrounded. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, faster than the storm outside. The wolves weren't attacking yet. They were testing the boundaries of the clearing, circling, gauging the strange shapes, the firelight, the scents. Lydia knew better than to panic. Wolves rarely attacked humans without reason, but hunger drove creatures to desperate choices. And winter hunger was the worst kind. She lifted the rifle to her shoulder, aiming toward the shadows beyond the fire's glow. A shape flickered at the edge of her vision, low, lean, and moving with deliberate stealth. A wolf stepped into the faint light, its fur slicked by rain, eyes reflecting the fire. It was larger than she expected, magnificent and terrifying. Her breath caught. Her finger rested lightly against the trigger, but she didn't pull it. She couldn't waste a shot unless there was no other option. The wolf stared at her for a long, tense moment, ears pricked, nose twitching. The fire crackled. Lydia didn't blink. Finally, the animal stepped back into the darkness. One danger avoided. But the night was far from over. More sounds echoed through the trees, brush shifting, claws against bark, soft pads in wet leaves. The pack wasn't retreating. They were waiting, watching. Lydia pulled the blanket tighter around herself, keeping the rifle ready. She whispered a shaky promise into the dim shelter. "We'll make it through this night." "I swear it." Outside, the forest prowled. Inside, she held on because she had no other choice. And the wolves, patient as the mountains themselves, circled in the dark. The storm broke sometime before dawn, though Lydia only realized it when she woke to silence. Not peace, just a quiet so absolute it felt eerie after the night's chaos. Her fire had burned down to glowing coals, giving barely enough warmth to blunt the edge of the morning chill. Her body ached, stiff from sleepless vigilance and the cold ground. Juniper snorted softly, stamping a hoof. That was what woke Lydia, some instinctive movement from the mare, somewhere between alert and agitated. Lydia's eyes snapped open. Her hand went immediately to the rifle. The wolves were gone. She could sense it. No shifting shadows, no soft panting breaths in the dark, no glowing eyes at the tree line. The storm had likely driven them deeper into the forest before daylight. She allowed herself a slow exhale, her shoulders relaxing a fraction. But Juniper was still restless, ears swiveling, breathing sharp and uneven. "Easy, girl," Lydia whispered, rising carefully to her knees. Her joints cracked in protest, her lower belly tightening with the effort. She pressed a hand there, half out of habit, half out of reassurance. The baby rolled in response, a slow, stubborn movement. The air felt colder than it should after a storm, crisp, metallic, and thick with the scent of wet pine. Lydia stepped out from beneath the lean-to, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The clearing was washed clean by rain, the ground muddy and dark. Droplets clung to branches like glass beads. And in the soft morning light, something caught her eye. Tracks. Not hoof prints. Not animal prints. Boot prints. Lydia froze, breath locked in her chest. She crouched slowly, inspecting them without disturbing the mud. A clear impression-deep heel, defined toe, edges sharp enough to show they were fresh, made perhaps an hour before dawn. Rain hadn't touched them, which meant they hadn't been there the night before during the storm. Someone had been here, while she slept, close enough to see her shelter, her fire, her vulnerability. Her pulse fluttered painfully. The tracks circled her camp, not directly approaching the lean-to, but staying just outside the firelight. Whoever it was had been watching without revealing themselves. Judging, perhaps. Waiting. A cold tremor ran through her. She rose and followed the prints carefully, rifle clutched in both hands. They moved along the tree line, circled behind the shelter, then disappeared into the forest's edge where the shadows still clung thick. Juniper let out a sharp whinny, jerking against her rope. Lydia spun, raising the rifle. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But the clearing felt different now, less like wilderness and more like a stage where she had unknowingly been performing. Exposed. Observed. Her throat tightened. She scanned the trees, heart thudding hard. "Who's there?" she called, hating the break in her voice. Silence answered her. The prints weren't from a small person. The size suggested a man, a large one. Someone comfortable enough to walk the mountains at night during a storm. No lantern tracks, no horse tracks. He had moved on foot quietly, which meant he knew these mountains better than she did. She turned, feeling suddenly small in the vastness of the clearing. Her shelter, once a symbol of resilience, now felt flimsy, fragile, exposed to more than the weather. Her mind raced through possibilities. A trapper? A hunter? A drifter? Someone harmless, or someone who followed a lone woman's wagon through the woods. She went still. Had he seen her? Had he stood close enough to hear her breathing? To see the swell of her belly? To watch her fight sleep with the rifle in her lap? Her skin crawled at the thought. Lydia checked the rifle, again 2 bullets. Not nearly enough against wolves. Even less against a man with unknown intentions. She backed toward the lean-to, watching the forest with narrowed eyes, forcing her breath to steady. Whoever he was, he had chosen not to approach her. That was the only comfort she had, and it wasn't much. But as she settled beneath the shelter again, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer simply enduring the wilderness. Someone else was out there. Someone who had seen her. Someone who might return. Lydia didn't truly sleep after finding the tracks. She drifted in and out of a strained half-rest, one hand resting on her belly, the other gripping the rifle as if it were an extension of her heartbeat. The storm had passed, but unease remained thick, clinging, impossible to shake. By mid-morning the clouds thinned, letting pale sunlight sift through the pines. Lydia used the brief calm to check her supplies and stretch her stiff limbs. Every movement reminded her of how close she was to her due date, how heavy, how delicate, how vulnerable her body had become. She stepped outside the shelter and scanned the clearing for more tracks. Nothing. No signs of wolves. No evidence the stranger had returned, but the forest felt watched. She moved to gather fallen branches for a small cooking fire. She'd barely taken a step when Juniper jerked her head up, ears pinned forward, nostrils flaring sharply. Lydia froze. A soft crunch echoed from the direction of the trees, too controlled to be an animal, too heavy to be a deer. A footstep, a deliberate one. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She clutched the rifle, turning slowly toward the sound. "Don't shoot," a deep voice rumbled. A man stepped out from behind a thick spruce, slow enough to show he wasn't trying to surprise her, careful enough not to startle the mare further. Lydia's grip tightened anyway. He was large, tall, broad-shouldered, rugged in a way that marked him as someone who lived far from towns. His coat was buckskin, patched and worn at the elbows. A thick beard covered his jaw, streaked with frost. His hair hung to his shoulders, wind-tangled. His gloves were off, his hands visible and open at his sides, non-threatening, but powerful enough to split logs barehanded. He looked like the mountains had carved him themselves. Her pulse thundered. "Stay where you are," He stopped immediately. Already did, he answered, voice low, surprisingly gentle. Ain't looking for trouble. You were here last night. Lydia hated how shaky the words sounded. He didn't deny it. He simply nodded once. Saw your smoke before the storm hit, she swallowed. Why didn't you approach me? The man shrugged slightly, as though the question had only one answer. Didn't want to spook you. Or your horse. His gaze flicked briefly to her belly, though only in a practical, assessing way. And I didn't figure you were in a state to welcome a stranger walking into camp. Lydia bristled. I'm capable of taking care of myself. A faint hint of a smile touched his mouth, not mocking, but acknowledging, respectful. So I saw. His eyes were sharp, an uncommon shade of gray-green like river water under shadow. They didn't roam over her in the way she feared. They didn't linger on her vulnerability. Instead, they studied her shelter, her fire pit, the exhausted set of her shoulders. His gaze was the gaze of someone who measured risk, terrain, storm patterns, and perhaps the condition of a lone woman who had survived a brutal night with nothing but grit and a half-built lean-to. She steadied her breath. Who are you? Name's Calder, he said. Calderboone. The name had weight to it. She'd heard rumors and town stories whispered by hunters and trappers about a lone mountain man who roamed these high ridges. A man who kept to himself, who helped lost travelers now and then, but didn't take kindly to troublemakers. Most believed he was half wild, half myth. But he was very real, standing 10 yards from her, letting her decide if he should come closer. Why are you here? She asked. He shifted his stance, boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. Storm was bad. Figured you'd need a hand come morning. I don't need charity, she snapped before she could stop herself. Calder's eyes softened. Didn't say you did. But you got wolves sniffing around, and not much shelter. And you're in a delicate condition. His voice gentled even more. Let me help. Don't cost you anything. Lydia's throat tightened. She hated needing help, hated the feeling of leaning on anyone again. But she also knew this. A mountain man didn't circle a camp all night just to harm someone. That wasn't how predators behaved. And Calderboone didn't stand like a predator. He stood like a man offering protection. Still, she kept her rifle raised. You stay where I can see you. He nodded without offense. Fair enough. Then he added, with a quiet certainty that made something inside her tremble. You're not alone out here, Lydia Hart, not anymore. For a long moment, neither Lydia nor Calder moved. The forest held its breath with them, misty, cold, and watchful. Lydia's fingers tightened around the rifle stock until her knuckles turned white. Every instinct warred inside her. Fear of strangers, pride in her own resilience, and the bone-deep exhaustion she had been ignoring for days. Calder didn't push forward. He simply stood, hands still visible, shoulders relaxed. He was large enough to be intimidating even at a distance, but something in the set of his eyes, steady, patient, kept her from bolting back under the shelter. You should sit, he said quietly. You're swaying. I'm not, Lydia began, irritation sparking, but as she took a breath, her vision blurred. A wave of dizziness washed over her so suddenly it felt like the ground tilted beneath her boots. Her knees trembled. Her belly tightened painfully, a cramp radiating across her hips. She sucked in a sharp breath and instinctively pressed a hand to her abdomen. Calder's posture changed instantly, alert, attentive, ready to move, but still anchored where he stood. You hurtin'? He asked, voice low but edged with concern. No, she insisted, though she could barely hear her own voice over the rushing in her ears. She took a step, intending to retreat toward her lean-to. Her foot slipped in the mud. The world tilted again. Her rifle dipped toward the ground. Calder took one decisive step forward. Easy. Don't, she tried, lifting a hand. Too late. Her body gave out. Her knees buckled, and the rifle slipped from her grasp. Lydia braced for the cold, hard impact of earth, but it never came. Instead, strong arms caught her under the shoulders, steadying her with far more gentleness than she expected from a man built like an oak. She gasped at the sudden closeness. Calder's coat smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, his breath warm in the cold air. His hands were rough, but careful, supporting her without gripping too tight, holding her upright without invading her space. "Steady now," he murmured, guiding her down slowly until she was seated on a dry patch of ground near the shelter. Lydia's pulse raced, from fear or relief or both. She sucked in several shaky breaths, blinking until her vision sharpened again. I didn't ask you to touch me," she said weakly, though the words lacked force. "No, ma'am," Calder replied. "But you were about to hit the ground." "Didn't reckon you'd thank me for letting that happen." Heat pricked behind her eyes, not embarrassment, not exactly. Something heavier. Something she'd fought for months. The realization that she was not capable of doing everything alone. Not in her condition, not here. Calder crouched in front of her, keeping a respectful distance, forearms resting casually on his knees. "You dehydrated," he said after studying her face. "Happens fast up here. Storm didn't help. Neither did spending half the night guarding that fire." She frowned. "You were watching?" "Wolves were watching too," he reminded her. "We kept each other awake." The way he said we stirred something fragile in her chest. He reached slowly into his pack, pulled out a tin cup and a water skin, and set them on the ground between them, close enough for her to reach, far enough that she didn't feel cornered. "You need water," he said. "And food. And rest that ain't on cold mud." Lydia's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words faltered. She was tired. So tired. The dizziness still lingered at the edges of her vision. "I can't rely on anyone," she whispered, mostly to herself. Calder's eyes softened in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Ain't a skin you two." She looked at him, startled. "I'm just saying," he continued gently, "that for as long as you're in these mountains, I ain't about to let you fight 'em alone." His words fell into the quiet clearing like a promise, unwanted, unexpected, and terrifying in the way it warmed her frozen resolve. Calder stood slowly, giving her space. "Drink, then we'll figure the rest." Lydia stared at the cup, at the man who had appeared from nowhere, at the forest that suddenly felt less empty. For the first time in a long time, she felt something shift inside her. Not surrender, not dependence, but the faintest flicker of safety. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The storm had eased by morning, leaving the world washed in white silence. Lydia woke to the faint crackle of the fire Calder had rebuilt, his tall figure crouched beside it, feeding thin pine branches into the embers with practiced, quiet movements. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how deeply she had slept, too deeply for a woman alone in the wilderness. Her hand flew instinctively to her belly. The baby shifted, strong and alive. Relief washed over her, followed by wariness. She should never have slept that soundly. Calder must have sensed she was awake because he spoke without looking at her. Fire died down. Cold was coming in. "Didn't want you waking up frozen." His tone was even, not overly familiar, not apologetic either, simply factual. Lydia didn't respond. She watched him, trying to read the man behind that frostbitten beard and calm voice. He moved with the quiet ease of someone born to the mountains, someone who respected the land, someone who knew its dangers intimately. But that didn't mean he could be trusted. Her fingers inched toward the rifle lying beside her bedroll. Calder's eyes flicked toward the motion just for a second and then back to the fire. "You don't need to point that thing at me again," he said simply. "But if it makes you feel safer, you go on keeping it close." That disarmed her more than any apology could have. Lydia swallowed, her throat tight. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "You helped. I'm grateful. but you don't owe me anything. You can go back to whatever you were doing before. Calder finally stood, brushing snow from his coat. He towered over her, though he kept a respectful distance. Ma'am, a storm like that leaves sign all over the place. Tracks, smells, noise. You're not the only one who noticed. He nodded toward the tree line. Lydia followed his gaze, spotting faint indentations in the snow she hadn't seen before. Paw prints. Large ones. Several sets. Wolf. At least 4. Maybe more. Her stomach turned cold. She clutched her belly. I can handle wolves, she said, though the words trembled. Not 8 months along you can't, he said bluntly, but without judgment. And not alone in a half-built shelter. Another long silence hung between them. Lydia hated the truth in his words, hated needing anyone, hated the vulnerability that had lodged itself in her chest since her husband died. Calder sensed her conflict but didn't press. I'm not here to crowd you, he said. I'll keep to the edge of the clearing. Hunt some meat. Patch your shelter so the next storm doesn't cave it in. When the weather clears, you can decide what comes next. Why? She whispered. Why help me at all? He shrugged, staring out into the snowy trees as though searching for an answer there. Because you're out here fighting a war no woman should fight alone. And because there's good in helping where you can. The simplicity of it softened something in her. Not trust, not yet, but the first fragile thread of it. By midday, Calder had reinforced the lean-to, added a windbreak of woven branches, and set a snare line farther down the ridge. Lydia watched him work from a distance, noting how he never stepped inside her shelter without permission, never came too close, never touched anything of hers unless she handed it to him. Respect, boundaries, patience. It had been a long time since any man had treated her like that. As night fell and wolves howled somewhere deep within the timber, Lydia felt the baby shift again, a rolling, insistent reminder of the life growing inside her. She placed a protective hand over her belly. Maybe she wasn't ready to trust him fully, but she could no longer deny one truth. For the first time since her husband died, she didn't feel completely alone. The wind returned with a vengeance that night, rattling the crude shelter Lydia had fought so hard to build. Rain lashed against the logs, and icy drafts curled through the gaps she had tried to seal. Every gust made the roof shudder. Every crack of thunder set her nerves on edge. She had been fighting exhaustion for days, and now her body sent a warning she couldn't ignore. A sharp, searing pain tore through her abdomen. She gasped, gripping her belly as another wave followed almost immediately. Contractions. Rapid, relentless, far earlier than expected. She clutched the blankets around her, panic rising. The baby her child was coming, and she wasn't in a proper cabin. Not even close. Her hands shook as she reached for the rifle, then realized its uselessness in this moment. She needed help, but she wasn't sure if she could trust herself to call out. Then Calder's voice cut through the storm, calm but urgent. Lydia, I heard you stay where you are. Before she could answer, he was there, large and steady, moving through the rain as though it were nothing. His coat was soaked, his hands bare but steady, and there was no hesitation in the way he crouched beside her. You're not alone, he said quietly, just as he had before. We do this together. Her pride flared, but the contractions left no room for argument. She nodded weakly, sinking onto the makeshift bed of blankets she had piled inside the lean-to. Calder guided her gently, supporting her back, helping her find a position that would allow her to bear the pain without toppling over. Breath by breath, contraction by contraction, Lydia fought. Sweat soaked her hair, rain dripped from her cloak, and her muscles burned from exhaustion. Calder never left her side. He boiled water over the fire, bringing her claws to keep clean, whispering encouragement instead of commands. Slow, deep breaths. You're strong. Baby's coming. We've got this. His calm, measured presence grounded her. She realized in that moment that survival wasn't about pride. Survival was about trust, about letting someone help when you couldn't do it alone. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes' time blurred in pain and focus. And then, with a final, shuddering effort, her child emerged into the cold, storm-lashed night. A boy, small, wet, but alive. The first sound, the baby's cry, cut through the howl of the wind, a pure, defiant note that made Lydia gasp and cry in relief simultaneously. Calder cleaned and wrapped the infant in blankets, holding him close to keep warmth. Lydia rested back, trembling with exhaustion and elation, eyes filling with tears she hadn't allowed herself in weeks. "He's beautiful," she whispered, voice hoarse. Calder nodded, handing the child gently to her. "He is, and he's strong like his mother." For the first time in months, Lydia allowed herself to breathe fully, to let the adrenaline fade and feel a rare, deep peace. The storm raged outside. The mountains remained untamed, but inside her lean-to, she held new life. Not just the baby, but a fragile hope she hadn't dared to imagine. That she could endure, that she could survive, that she could thrive even here, in the wild, in the mountains that had seemed so merciless. Calder didn't intrude. He stayed close but let her mother the child, offering only what she needed. His presence was quiet, respectful, patient. She realized with a sharp clarity that he was not there to control or claim, but simply to stand by her when she needed it most. And as she held her son to her chest, Lydia finally understood that this night, this struggle, this storm, this man had changed her world forever. She was no longer surviving alone. She was building something new. Dawn broke over the mountains, soft and golden, spilling light across the storm-washed forest. The wind had died to a whisper. The rain softened into scattered droplets clinging to pine needles like crystal beads. Lydia sat in the lean-to, cradling her newborn son against her chest, feeling the warmth of life she had fought so fiercely to bring into the world. The baby slept, tiny chest rising and falling, oblivious to the hardships of the night, a new hope in a harsh, wild world. Calder had been awake long before her, tending to the fire, reinforcing the shelter's weak points and checking the perimeter for lingering wolves or other dangers. He emerged now from the tree line, carrying bundles of dry wood and a small sack of supplies. He paused a few steps away, giving her space, though his eyes never left her. "You rested?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost careful. Lydia nodded. "As much as one can after last night." He smiled faintly, a rare softness in his rugged face. "Good, the storm's passed. Thought I might start on something more permanent." "Permanent?" her voice caught. She knew the lean-to, sturdy as it was, could not last the winter. Not with snow, wind, and the unpredictability of the mountains. He nodded, pulling from his pack a few rough-hewn boards and tools. "I'll build a cabin nearby. Close enough to help if you need it, but far enough that you keep your space. I figure you've had enough of strangers telling you what to do." Lydia blinked. She wanted to argue, to insist she could manage alone. She wanted to protect her pride. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. She could survive, yes, but survival and thriving were two different things. And last night had taught her the value of not being alone. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning it in a way she had never meant words before. Calder nodded, already moving toward a small clearing he had chosen for the cabin. Lydia watched him work, admiring his efficiency, the careful way he selected timber, the quiet patience with which he built. There was no rush, no show of power, just steady, reliable effort. As the morning wore on, Lydia tended to her son, teaching him the rhythm of the mountains, feeling his tiny hands curl around her fingers. Every so often, she would glance toward Calder, who worked like a man who had lived his entire life in the wild. And slowly, a sense of possibility began to bloom within her. Possibility. Not just survival, not just enduring. but building, creating, living. By mid-afternoon, Calder had the basic structure of a small cabin, standing walls straight, roof slanted against snow and wind, a hearth ready for fire. He stood back, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked toward Lydia. "All yours," he said simply. "Or ours, if you decide you want me nearby. Won't impose." She smiled, a mixture of gratitude and cautious hope. "I think I'd like that. Nearby, I mean." "Not too close," he chuckled, a deep, warm sound that seemed to blend with the mountains themselves. "Fair enough." For the first time since Thomas's death, Lydia felt the weight on her heart lift. She was not merely surviving the wilderness, she was alive. She had her child, a future to shape, and now someone she could trust not to control her life, but to share in the challenges of this rugged world. As the sun sank behind the peaks, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Lydia held her son close, watching Calder finish the last of the cabin's framework. Snow dusted the roof and the ground around them, and the air smelled of pine, wet earth, and promise. She realized something profound. The mountains, once lonely and forbidding, were now home. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready not just to endure but to live. She was no longer alone. And for Lydia Hart, her newborn son, and Calder Boone, that was more than enough to begin a new life in the high country.